So we've had a lot of posts on Instagram over the last several weeks talking about the bench press. And of course, that's leading into some of the things that we're talking about on T equals R, the shoulder. And they're all going to kind of match up. There might even be things that we talk on Instagram that were not on the digital product. So it's all a big story that we're trying to weave together, some long-term storytelling, if you will. Now, on Instagram, we talked about maybe using dumbbells. We talked about using the lats. We talked about arching in a competitive bench press environment. Talked about certainly pinching the shoulder blades together and how that can absolutely lead to anterior shoulder pain. I mean, I don't know any big bench presser that doesn't have cranky shoulders, and to what degree of those shoulders cranky is all up for discussion. There's also a concept that maybe the correct way to create some tendon resiliency might be to even be in that position. So if the tendons are being overloaded, they get pissed off, but they kind of have to be loaded. I don't know if that's the best answer to create that, but it's maybe worthy of discussion if somebody's actually interested in discussing it, rather than arguing that they want to do it their way because it follows their model that they think is the only way. And there's always multiple ways to get someplace. They're good, better, and best, but certainly lots of different ways. Anyway, one of the things that we didn't put, because it doesn't really relate so much to bench press, is really this concept of what do you do about it when you do have the anterior humeral glide, forward, back. So when you're not centrated and we're forward a little bit, as we talked about, the tendons in front of the shoulder become lengthened, and then they become lengthened again when you drop the bar on your chest. So if we are interested in that, well, of course, you can not lengthen them as much, and maybe you won't have that same perception of threat when you're dropping the bar on your chest. But really what I think is super useful to even prophylactically combat certain activities that will lead to this anterior humeral glide, and this very difficult to always pinpoint which structure is the problem. I think there are ways to do that, and we'll get into maybe where the value of an MRI is in this type of case. But mobilizing the posterior side is something that's going to be real crucial. Not so much to build a monster bench, but to allow you to continue to train to build a monster bench. I think those are two different things. So think of it as like what's happening when this moves forwards, and then like I described, there's a lot of length, that end range ability to tolerate tension is minimized. In the rear, there's a stiffening in the rear. So now I'll say this is the back and over here is the front. And there's this almost like pinching, if you will. That's how I envision it. That's how I try to figure this out. I don't think that's ever something that you'll see on ultrasound. But in my mind, it's not that it just pushes one way and just stays there. When it pushes and the tissue adapts posteriorly, then I kind of think of it as this folding on each other. And then it needs to get long, but it needs to be unfolded. So what do? Well, I think tissue work is crucial, as long as we're appreciating that the goal of that type of therapy, whether it's manual therapy, whether it's dry needling, those are the two that come to mind. Manual therapy can mean a million different things. I'm not sure there's a significant difference at all, any kind of difference in the different types of commercial manual therapies. Whatever works is the correct one to create a relaxed environment. Certainly you're going to create some blood flow, which should, in a short term, change the extensibility. Talk about the stress strain curve. Lots of things change, becomes more elastic than plastic. So you do need to get in and then find that area of plasticity of the tissue. Elastic means you get it long and then it comes back. That's what happens when you heat something up. It's why sometimes stretching is not ideal. So it's not so much the blood flow that we're after, but it's more, in my mind, it's more of the relaxation of other tissues that can create tension. So it's going to be primarily contractile elements. Needling or good manual therapy can also have a systemic effect to create a relaxed environment. A relaxed environment is more variable. A relaxed environment has an opportunity to change a little bit easier. So I think we can start there. And sure enough, just banging around the posterior shoulder, you're going to find some hot spots. Maybe it's the infraspinatus and teres minor. Maybe it's just the posterior deltoid. Obviously, the supraspinatus comes in that area. There's a lot of targets. That's where MRI might come in. So if you know this row home, I think of the front of the shoulder as that this row of Philly row homes where they all share the same attic because there's no walls in between each attic. So a fire over here is going to affect all the houses down there. So even if it's something that's like a subscapularis, I don't know that it's so easy to determine whether your target should be an isolated subscapularis or something that's more on the lateral side of that tube of the intertubercular groove, which would be like your teres minor infraspinatus, the stuff that comes off the backside. On the lateral side, teres minor, infraspinatus, supraspinatus. On the biceps tendon, then on the inside, subscapularis, teres major, lats, and pecs. So it's like this big row, and it's very, very difficult. Oh, I have biceps tendinosis. I find it very hard to believe that performance of the infraspinatus would always be elite. So you're just banging around with your therapy without really knowing. Still, something good can happen. And I'm not sure it's very common, and whether we talk about the specificity and sensitivity of special tests of the shoulder for particular issues, which also includes the labrum, I don't find that this is really a valuable approach. Front of your shoulder hurts. Then if we find one performance test that is more limited than the other, then of course you find your target. But MRI should be able to then really focus on one tissue versus the other. But that backside, once it's more available to adapt, to mobilize, to change the direction of the collagen, then that's where side-lying series that we saw, if you're on the list for T equals R shoulder, we put this entire component of how do you use some of these side-lying positions where you flip-flop the joint by joint theory. And this is true in any type, at least in my mind, and the way I try to integrate things, and that's what this is all about. This is my thing. I say what I want. This is how I think that joint by joint flip-flops a lot when you go down to the floor. It can be quadruped, sideline, even half kneeling, where what is mobile in the vertical becomes stable when you're down on the ground. And that further complicates and gives people some heat to explain that a joint by joint theory is this or that. It works every time. It's just a concept. It's really just a way to try to think through, what am I trying to accomplish? And if this joint can do this, then something good will happen. If this joint can't do this, then I think this not so good thing will happen. So moving forward, if we can look at creating a mobile scapula on a stable humerus, because if you're lying down on your side, the humerus isn't going anywhere. And as I can roll over my downside shoulder, I should be able to get a level of effectiveness of that posterior capsule that is both active and getting long. Versus like your old school baseball stress, it seems like we're kind of trying to do the same thing. And I think you can stabilize the shoulder blade and maybe not get as much, but it's going to be a little bit more challenging, especially when somebody's really jacked up going back from those heavy bench presses. So we looked at side lying. You could also take it up to low oblique sitting where you're posted up on your forearm. You can be posted up on your hand in this high side lying oblique sitting position. So they're all really, really similar, where it's some version of even what you would call side plank, where we're long in the legs rather than being long up top in the hands. All of those positions have a significant opportunity to mobilize the posterior capsule by rolling and turning, if you will. It is a roll because it's an ipsilateral pattern, but creating length, but also creating eccentric control. So mobilizing the posterior side is in how we got there. Of course, we're using bench press as an example, but you can get there in a lot of ways. But by softening up the back, kind of strengthening the front in an isolated fashion, and then the primary goal is to mobilize that backside with some of these sideline positions, oblique sitting positions, etc. This is a nice little package that you can put together where you're looking at things from a motor control standpoint, but also looking at the local tissue. Posterior capsule stiff, you got to change it. Tendon at the rotator cuff pieces or biceps tendon piece, we've got to change it. Those are often going to be this trigger. This is going to be the perception of threat that doesn't feel really, really good. And that's where we try to change those perceptions and then create movement and length under tension, which we do think should be able to mobilize that posterior capsule, and always using tolerance to pressure with other forms of training in terms of fitness. And then of course, staying ideally hydrated with all forms of fluid to that area, which again goes back to what are we trying to accomplish with the needling or the therapy. So mobilizing posterior capsule, I think as many people know, will solve a lot of issues. The one issue we're talking about here is trying to recentrate that humeral head when it's living a little bit forward.